Jenn, I'm really happy that you're here, and when the chairs are coming, then we can sit here too. So Jenn is from Burning Man and from the Burning Man Project as an organization. They are trying to, what are you doing as an organization?
Oh, okay. Well, Burning Man is a very large event that happened in 1986 in the Black Rock Desert of Nevada. Thank you. And we've since turned into a nonprofit that is seeking to help encourage arts and cultural initiatives around the world through civic participation in arts grants and seed funding.
So we have heard already that obviously you're building a temporary city, like 70,000 this year, 78, 75, pushing 80?
We're actually 70,000. We're not allowed to grow for the time being, but the event has been sold out for a number of years now.
Who has been to Burning Man? Everybody on stage and 2 or 3 in the audience. So I think this bridge of having a temporary city is something which is, I think, for me interesting because the culture creates the city all of a sudden. It seems like that. We see truth is beauty and different art, huge installations, so how do you what's your notion of, let's say, the technology also you need as an infrastructure to go there, and the cultural aspect of having a temporary city and an intentional community? How can you see, why is Burning Man maybe a hotbed of the maker movement or some of these things? How is that reflected?
Well, I think that to start with, Burning Man puts its civic activities, should we sit down, in the center of its city. We are a city where we encourage our participants and our community to come and program the space themselves. We encourage participation on the highest level, and we are a volunteer community. You can't buy or sell anything at Burning Man. So this encourages people to be radically self-reliant. Peter showed some of the 10 principles earlier, and it's those principles that are actually a reflection of what occurred organically that engage people into making things and trying things and doing things. And when they do that, they often find a true sense of themselves. They're encouraged to be exposed to different things they might not have known how to do before. So it's that makes Burning Man truly a catalyst for culture and arts and community. And the maker movement is something that we are deeply involved with as well. I'd say we're very much so a maker city, as Peter said earlier. However, we're a little bit different than the traditional making environment because we put art as a priority. So it's more like STEAM versus STEM in terms of the making environment, which is found to be very important for arts and culture.
Awesome. I also wanted to introduce Inga Wellmann to you. She is from the Hamburg Cultural Office or Senate or Ministry of Culture. And you are especially working on the relationship where culture and startup and the creative cluster are coming together. So how can you describe what you do to the audience?
Well, we work on developing and really making sort of the framework for creators and cultural people a much better within the city in order to actually live from their ideas and not just try something out and do something completely different in their main time. So what we do is we give we establish new financial systems or develop, for example, crowdfunding systems that apply to the region. We develop spaces in order to give people space in order to experiment and meet people from very different disciplines. And we just sort of give them advice or create formats for connecting people, because most of the people don't actually interact much. You would think that in the creative scene, but apart from sort of those people who usually work together, we realize that a lot of people still are very much within their scene. And my main target also for the next years is really to improve the connections between the cultural creative scene and established industries, established systems. So, for example, public administration, because what you said before about the sort of jazz city, you make a city as a jazz city, I think that really applies. That's the biggest challenge in order to really implement this into a city, be it Hamburg or any other city in the world, that you have to achieve, in actually transposing this set of ideas and values of makers or people who sort of think in a very multidisciplinary way and actually get these people together. At the moment, there's a lot of potential just lying around, and I'd love to actually create more formats or more, frameworks where this true innovation can flourish. So that's what we're doing right now with new funds of the European Union.
So how, if you compare artists, as you say maybe, and we take the music notion, you probably have a lot of, let's say the first violins. So there's a lot of a set of first violins, you have to get them together. But now let's bring them in a bigger orchestra, right? So you have maybe if technology or all the different things around are the drums and everything else, and just maybe art was focusing on this only. So how can you bring all the technology advancements and what Greg and Peter was saying? How can we leverage, let's say, culture that it also plays an important part in this whole technology advancement, because we know this is so rapidly and it's over, taking most of our attention and a lot of obviously funding as well. How can we? What's your reflection on the speakers? So how can we bring culture a little bit more into this mainstream and driving some of the developments in cities or in our urban developments?
Well, one first step, of course, and that's a very traditional basic step, is to bring culture and technology more together in the way that you actually digitize cultural goods and services and practices and make them available, via all these devices, etc. But that's a very traditional. That's sort of that's about something that is already existing, and then. For example, using iBeacon technology for music festivals or theatre festivals or plays, etc. That's a good first step, but that's not enough. I think the bigger or the most important step is to really implement or introduce people with from the artists and creative side into, for example, companies like Autodesk is doing naturally. They always have artists in residence, as far as I know. So these people are there in order to test materials to the limits and really try out things that engineers would never think of, and that's the challenge we are facing. So that's really something that I want to propose for established industries and non-cultural systems to open up to people really working with them and not just having culture and arts as something that you consume or experience when you have some kind of spare time.
So Peter, and we all, I think it seems like we are fans of Italy, and every talk there was a little bit Italian notion. Do we have already some of the Italian Milano contingency here? They're probably here already. So we have, I think, 10 Italians coming from Milan, and we are talking about the Milan Expo, which is probably right now maybe not the smartest city, but one of the new things, which they also took food and new stuff and development. So and from your, let's say, Silicon Valley perspective, a little bit zooming out of Europe, how can you compare or can you get a vibe of where Germany, Italy, some of the other nations, can you see some differentiations between these kind of countries? Or countries don't matter, you just have to focus on cities? Yeah, I think you still.
Right.
Switch to you first.
Yeah, well, I would say that countries is probably too large of an aggregate. So for me, if we're talking about the United States, I'm originally from New Orleans and I spent some time growing up in Minnesota. Peter's from New York, we live in San Francisco. Those are four completely different worlds. So when we're talking about Europe moving within Italy from a Palermo or a Napoli to a Milan or a Torino, those are completely different worlds. So now moving, getting on the plane in Florence and getting off in Hamburg is a culture shock. So these things that we're doing, the city, to me, is a critical scale, because that's really the scale at which government becomes face-to-face with property owners, with landowners, with business owners, and with local citizens. So that's really critical, and that's also where some of the politics start to melt away. So I would really look at that scale, and in that case, everything's different and everything's fresh, and we just need to figure out how to take best practices and adapt them at a local district or city level.
You do see interesting experiments. Barcelona hit this notion of a maker city very early on. They had Fab Lab Barcelona there, which was the international Fab Lab movement. In a country that is facing economic problems, they really thought a lot about local manufacturing and self-sufficiency. London is doing an amazing job with City as a Lab, with the project that's going on there. Partly that's because when you have a country where the capital city dominates the country and it's such a great center of finance, you have the opportunity of getting that kind of scale going on. I think Mayor Puto, who you saw from in Pittsburgh, convened a number of leaders from Northern Europe and Scandinavia because of their use of outdoor design and sustainability in the deliberate redesign of what's going on in Pittsburgh. I think, to kind of hackney this jazz analogy to death, what's really interesting now is the collaboration and exchange among cities. As cities become this great unit, there's so much that we can learn from one another. And the real question is, if a city's a lab, how do you make that they don't compete and these ideas go back and forth and they build on each other? And that's a lot of the work that we're doing right now. The output of that conference we just had is literally to say, how do you build a global lab? So like open source, you add things to it and people take from it, and they're incented to do that. That's, I think, the next great game.
Awesome. Who has a question for the panel? You thought about a question? If you have, yell. So maybe as a closing question, we have a lot of startups here and people who have entrepreneurs, who have ideas. And if you look from the outside, it looks like, smart city, it sounds like e-government, and it's something like, a big bulky thing. But where do you see all like the cracks in the system where we can go in with ideas, with new opportunities, and where can startups or entrepreneurs really start to play on that platform rather than just kind of say, I didn't get a meeting with a mayor, I probably cannot do anything. I have my opinion about it, but where do you all see opportunities for creative people, for entrepreneurs, and for people who have a passion for doing something in this current state? And then why don't we start from you, Greg?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that I've learned about in the last couple months, I'm certainly not an expert on it yet, but in terms of a European program and a difference from an American reality, because a lot of what we're talking about is funding and access to support. So the FIWARE program that the European Union is funding right now is an open source API program that goes across platforms. So the idea is to create really simple exchangeable API that can be used across disciplines, and it's once you're involved with that, you're also getting support on it. So I think that sort of thing would not necessarily happen in the United States. It would happen very differently, but in terms of a unique European reality, that FIWARE program holds a lot of potential for how to both support innovation, but also create platforms for exchange that will become a library of API and hopefully what I'm calling soft systems for solutions for how to exchange know-how and support across disciplines.
There's a couple of these startups here, so you can ask them what their real experience is with the program. Jen?
Yeah, I'd just like to point out that, so Burning Man has a regional network that is around the world and over 60 organic offshoot events. Each one are sort of like little catalysts, and what we're seeing is that these regional groups, they have their own collaborations and their own sort of networks and their own affiliations on a local level. So Burning Man Project, Burning Man's nonprofit, has now created an exchange platform so that those groups can learn from each other and explore new potentials and actually collaborate even across different meta regions. So we have a global leadership conference in San Francisco, which is basically like an unconference where people can come together and skill share and exchange experiences, but we also did that for the very first time in 2014 in Berlin, which was lovely because there's a very rich, vibrant kind of burner culture and hacker culture and maker culture in Berlin, and that kicked off the start of our kind of exchange of the European unions coming together to do things. And I think to Peter's point, and he mentioned the National Week of Making at the White House that just happened in 2014, then again this year, I think that by encouraging partnership, as Greg said, public-private partnerships, and having all these different kind of cohorts of makers and entrepreneurs and burners and festivals come together and really educate their youth and show how they can explore new potentials together, we're seeing this kind of mashup of intellectual properties and outcomes, which is really beautiful.
Yeah. William Burroughs once said, "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." And I think it's you don't actually have to do so much in order to use the crack in the system. You just have to make it quite visible. You have to bring people with a different mindset into those structures that are still, working with a mindset that comes from older, maybe industrial ages, in order to facilitate these exchanges, because they happen everywhere in everyday life. And I think, and that's sort of what helps me most at the moment, is really find very good examples. And I'm very grateful for your presentations, because they really visualized how much potential lies within, in this connection between arts, technology, science, engineering, economy, etc. For example, having startups like this Hamburg-based company, Sonomed, with their Tinny Tracks project, that was a real good example, because it's a device or a software system that will allow to diminish tinnitus. The sound, I don't know actually. Is that the same thing, tinnitus? The sound in your ear. By sort of filtering frequencies out of your favorite music. So it's actually something that works with music that you want to listen to, and it's got at the same time sort of curing effect. And this startup actually started, they won a prize in our little competition that we have here in Hamburg. It's called Music Works, that connects music and sort of digital business ideas. Then they went to ConFestival, where they they turned up in the startup section, and that's something that, of course, gave them an even larger audience. And this made them be sent to the South by Southwest in Austin this year, where they actually won, the first prize in their section. And that actually helps so much in just convincing people here of local authorities of what, where the innovation, where the potential lies. So that's something I'm always grateful when I hear these examples. So yeah.
Harold, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, so often when people hear smart city, you think e-government or some, when you think if I'm selling to the government, at which point your venture capitalist says, please do anything but get involved in government sales. And what's remarkable is how much the city opportunity has become something in the last couple of years. There's an incubator in San Francisco called Tummel, and they focus on civic innovation, about 3 years old. And when they were starting, nobody knew if you could build a business, bringing people together to go essentially build city services for consumers that could make money on their own. They're a smashing success. They have companies like Hand Up, which is a way that individuals can support homeless or people who can't support themselves, but rather handing out something in the street, they actually register and you support goals they need. Neighborly reimagines municipal bonds, and that's a terrific, interesting one. And there's just, if you go on their site, you can see lots and lots of those. Transportation, whether you're talking about shared vehicles like Uber or Lyft or Chariot, which is shared buses, just complete innovation there. Really, what's needed now is regulatory issues. These have raised a lot of regulatory issues in the US. We generally are a little more friendly than they are in the EU about letting people try stuff. And, for example, in France, Uber is not going over too well this week. And also, in the US, where we don't fund these things as much, because there's less government money, we are trying things like entrepreneurs in residence. San Francisco has an entrepreneur in residence where you go hang out at City Hall and, you're building something. For example, the airport needed access for people who were sight impaired, and they found someone that were doing that. They gave them access to the airport, and now they're trying stuff worldwide. And you do see that in things like Catapult London, the lab there. I would say a really great resource is looking at what things like Tummel and Code for America are doing in San Francisco just as an idea book, and that's a great way to get started to think through how to duplicate or go further out here.
I have like 20 more questions, but I think we have to finally try to stick to the schedule. So I need you to get me a real big round of applause for this esteemed panel. Thank you so much, guys.